من التزم السلفية حصل الخير كله وحصل أجرا عظيما وفيرا كبيرا لأنه لزم هدي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد، فإن خير الكلام كلام الله عز وجل، وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وشر الأمور محدثاتها، وكل محدثة بدع، وكل بدعة دلالة، وكل دلالة في النار. وبعد. Welcome the dear brothers and sisters to another lesson from the lessons of studying the Kitāb al-Tawḥīd and looking at the explanation by our Shaykh Ṣāliḥ al-Fawzān حفظه ta'ala from the book al-Mulakhas fi Sharh Kitāb al-Tawḥīd, the concise explanation of Kitāb al-Tawḥīd. And we're still continuing with the first chapter, and today is the 25th of Jumādá al-Ūlá, the year 1445 al-Hijrah, corresponding to the 9th of December, the year 2023. Alhamdulillah, from the blessings of Allah is that Allah gives us the ability to study and learn about His Tawḥīd, since it is the most important matter that a person can learn about. Learning about his Creator, who created him and gave him sustenance and looks after all his matters. So Alhamdulillah, we're still looking at this first chapter of Kitāb al-Tawḥīd and looking at the third evidence that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, the great Imam, rahimahullah wa radiyallahu anhu, Shaykh al-Islam, compiled in this magnificent book, since it's just a compilation of hadith and ayat. Compilation of hadith and ayat. Likewise is the methodology of the great scholar Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim, compiling as evidences the Quranic ayat and the authentic hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the third ayah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, that Allah ordered, commanded, bequested, that your Lord bequested that none should be worshipped except Him, and to be kind and good, generous to your parents. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, be kind to your parents. So we looked at this ayah, and as a heading for the ayah, or the faidah from the ayah, a general meaning, we could say that here Allah commands us to have Tawḥīd. Allah commands us to have Tawḥīd. Like the previous ayah, this same chapter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنْ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ, that indeed we sent in every nation or every people a messenger commanded or ordered to worship Allah and to keep away from the false deities. And this ayah that we gave the benefit or the title for it is that prophets were sent with Tawḥīd. And the ayah before that, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that I did not create jinn or mankind except to worship me, and that is, the benefit of that is the purpose of creation. So we're looking at this ayah, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. So previously we looked at the vocabulary of this ayah, the different words of the sayings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this ayah. Now we're looking at the meaning, that the general meaning that Shaykh Ṣāliḥ al-Fawzān brings. Remember that the Shaykh, the style that he wrote this book in is that he brings you general meanings of the words, and then a general meaning of the ayah, then the reason why this ayah is in this chapter, and then what points we can benefit from the ayah or the evidence here. So the Shaykh says, al-ma'na al-ijmali lil-ayah, the general meaning of this ayah, al-ikhbaru anna Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala amara wa wassa ala al-suni rusulihi an yu'bad wahdahu duna ma sawahu. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us, he brings us the khabar, the information, informs us with his command and his wasiyyah, his bequest, his advice for us on the tongues of the messengers, that he alone should be worshipped above everyone else, above anything else. That Allah is the one to be worshipped alone rather than anybody else. This shows us the importance of Tawḥīd, and all the scholars taught Tawḥīd. And the Shaykh says, أَنْ يُحْسَنَ الْوَلَدُ إِلَى وَالِدَيْهِ إِحْسَانًا بِالْقَوْلِ وَالْفِعْلِ, that a son or a child is good to his parents, is kind to his parents in statement and in action. وَلَا يُسِيءِ إِلَيْهِمَا, and he's not bad to them, and he's not evil towards them. لأنهما اللذان قام بتربيته في حال صغره وضعفه, because his two parents, his parents are those who gave him that, nurtured him while he was young and weak, حتى قوي واشتد, until he became strong and he became upright. So this is the general meaning of the ayah, and as we can see from this ayah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is negating worship except for him, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. He's negating worship for anybody else and affirming it for him alone, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then the reason why this ayah was mentioned, the Shaykh says, munasibatul ayah bil bab anna tawheed huwa akidul huquq, that Tawheed is the most emphasized of rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأَوْجَبَ الْوَاجِبَاتِ, and it's the most obligatory matter. لأن الله بدأ به في الآية, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned it in the beginning of the ayah. He mentioned وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ. The beginning of the verse starts with that. So it shows us the importance of Tawheed. And this is what the scholars do when they sit down and reflect upon verses of the Quran. They say, well, why did this happen first, and why did this come second, and does this follow on from that point, and these type of matters? They look into the ayat with detail. So it is the most emphasized point in this ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala began with it. وَلَا يَبْتَدِعُ إِلَّا بِالْأَحَمْ فَالْأَحَمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not begin with something except that it shows its importance. Except that it shows its importance. Then the Shaykh moves on and he talks about مَا يُسْتَفَادُ مِنَ الْآيَةِ. This is how he breaks up the book. This lakhas, or Sharh Kitāb at-Tawḥīd, this concise explanation of Tawḥīd, he breaks it up like that. So he says, مَا يُسْتَفَادُ مِنَ الْآيَةِ. Yustafad mean benefits from this ayah. Number one, that Tawheed is the first matter that Allah commanded from the obligatory duties. That Tawheed is the first matter that Allah commanded from the wajibat, the obligatory duties. وهو أول الحقوق الواجبة على العبد, and it is the first obligation, first right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the slave. And we can see that when we look at the order of the Quran, the order of the Quran, the way the Quran has been compiled, we see that the first command, when we start reading from Surah Fatiha and Surah Baqarah, Alif Lam Mim, we find that the first command that we come across Ya ayyuhan nasu u'budu rabbakum. That's the first command. First page and a half is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informing us about the hypocrites and these type of matters. And then the first command that comes in the Quran, in the tartib of the Quran, in the arrangement of the Quran, is worship your Lord. Worship your Lord. Okay? To all people, Allah is commanding them, worship your Lord. So here we find that this is the first wajib, obligation. And the first question that will be asked in the grave is, who is your Lord? Who is your Lord? This is the first question in the grave. So that shows us the importance of the Tawḥīd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tawḥīd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, it's the first thing that a person becomes Muslim with. When a person wants to become Muslim, the first matter that he's told about is Allah. It shows us the obligation and the importance of Tawḥīd. And the last thing that a person leaves this dunya with is La ilaha illallah, the obligation of Tawḥīd. The Prophet ﷺ said in authentic hadith, لَقِّنُوا مَوْتَاكُمْ بِاللَّا إِلَهَ illallah. Encourage your dying people to say La ilaha illallah. So this means the last matter which we leave the dunya with is La ilaha illallah, is Tawḥīd. So it shows us the great emphasis, the great importance, the obligation of Tawḥīd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's very sad and unfortunate that majority of the Muslims do not understand or do not know and do not comprehend this importance of Tawḥīd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you find most of them, they fall into shirk, that which opposes Tawḥīd and cancels out Tawḥīd. It's very sad to see that this is the hal of the state of the Muslims. And understanding Tawḥīd is not just in the aspect of knowing that Allah is the only one to be worshipped, but on all the other aspects of Aqidah as well. So for example, when we look at Qadr, we see that is the Qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We understand the Qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is written down, is the knowledge of Allah. It also falls under Tawḥīd as well. So a person cannot be separated in his life from any matter whatsoever away from Tawḥīd. Tawḥīd affects his life in every single matter. Like we mentioned before in the previous lesson, and we're going to mention it again, that when we look at our food that we're about to eat, we try to link it up with Tawḥīd. So we know, first of all, that Allah is the Razik. So Allah is the one who creates, Allah is the Khaliq. Allah created this food. I did not create it. Allah created the food. The rizq. Allah is the one who provided me with that food. Allah provides the insects, the ants, with water and food. Allah supplies them with that. Allah is the Razik. Allah is the provider. So straight away we see Tawḥīd al-Rububiyyah. Then when we say Bismillah at the beginning, and we say the dua when we're finishing eating, we recognize that we're looking at Tawḥīd Ibadah, Tawḥīd Uluhiyyah, because we're actually carrying out the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise is when we say, the Prophet ﷺ said, Ad-du'a huwa al-ibadah. That making dua, raising your hand and saying dua, or without raising your hand, asking Allah for something, is worship. So likewise when we say Bismillah, and we say the dua at the end of the eating, Tawḥīd Uluhiyyah. And then when we say Bismillah, we're looking at the name of Allah. It's Asma wa Sifat. So a person can never be disconnected from Tawḥīd in the whole of his life. The whole of his life is connected, every matter connected to his life is connected to Tawḥīd. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ told us, encourage your dying people to say La ilaha illallah. Because even in death, we are not, even when we're dying, we're not separated from Tawḥīd. We're not separated from this aspect of Tawḥīd. Then number 3, the Shaykh says, ما في الكلمة لا إله إلا الله من النفي والإثبات. We mentioned this before as well, and this is something which is continuous. It's something which is continuous. That La ilaha illallah has a negation and affirmation. Negation and affirmation. And we find this to be the case in all matters. So, not just in Tawheed, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha, that there is no deity, okay, that's nafi, negation, illallah, affirmation, affirming that you have to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So likewise in the ayah, previously mentioned, وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنْ نَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ, to worship Allah, وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ, keep away from the Taghut. And this is the case in so many things. So we affirm the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and we negate bid'ah. We negate innovation. We affirm being kind to our parents, and we negate disobedience and being bad to our parents. So you'll find this qaida, this principle, is a principle which is applied through the whole of the religion of Islam. Okay, negating and affirmation. Likewise in Asma wa Sifat, we affirm that Allah, so we negate that there is anything like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Laysa kamithlihi shay. Khalas, there's nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we affirm, like Allah affirmed in the ayah, huwa as-sami'ul basir, that Allah hears everything and He sees everything. Then the Shaykh goes on, regarding this point number 3, ما في الكلمة لا إله إلا من النفي والإثبات, negation and affirmation, ففيها دليل على أن التوحيد لا يقوم إلا على النفي والإثبات. And in this is a dalil, proof that Tawheed is not established except with negating and affirmation. Nafi al-ibada amma siwa Allah, negating any worship for other than Allah, wa ithbataha lillah, and affirming it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you go down into the Arabic and deep study of this, you'll see the importance that, subhanallah, that means my submission has to be purely for Allah's sake. I have to purely submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the problem with the Muslims. The problem with the Muslim is that we choose to, or we're deluded in submitting ourselves completely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we find it difficult for a Muslim sister to put on a hijab. She finds it difficult to put on hijab because she hasn't gone to that level of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We understand that I cannot worship anybody. I have to have complete submission to Allah because I affirm that. Then they find it easy to practice the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And like maybe a brother finds it difficult to grow his beard. That's because there's a lack of submission to the Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That lack of affirmation, affirming that I'm only allowed to worship Allah, my submission is only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what basically Islam is. Islam is submitting oneself to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordered through His Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Then the third point the Shaykh mentions, Shaykh Ṣāliḥ, Azamatul Haqq al-Walidain, the great status or the great right of the parents. The great status and the right of parents. حَيْثُ أَتَفَى حَقُّهُمَا عَلَى حَقِّهِ, whereby Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala linked up His right with their right. Rights of this. وَجَاءَ فِي الْمَرْتَبَةِ الثَّانِيَةِ, and it came in the second level. So the first right is the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, complete and absolute right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the greatest right. And after that comes the rights of the parents. The rights of the parents. That you're good and kind to them. You're good and kind to them. So you don't say anything that would hurt their feelings. You don't say anything that would harm them. that will cause them any sadness. You try your best, you ask Allah for aid and support in being kind and good to your parents, because they were the reason for you to be present, existing on this planet. They were the reason, by Allah's permission, that you came into existence. You came into existence when you were nothing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you in the womb of your mother. In the womb of your mother. So she has the greatest rights. She has the greatest rights. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned, when a man came, he said, who has the greatest rights? And the Prophet ﷺ said, your mother. He said, then who? He said, your mother. Then he said, then who? Then your mother. And then he said, then who? Then your father. Even then, the father holds a great status in Islam, a great status in Islam, because the father is the head of the household, but the mother has 3 rights in the sense of your generosity, your kindness, your gentleness, and your love for her. Then the Shaykh mentions point number 4, وجوب الإحسان إلى الوالدين بجميع أنواع الإحسان. See how the Shaykh levels it up. First he mentions about the great right of the parents. Now he's saying the obligation of kindness to your parents with all types of kindness, all matters of goodness. لأنه لم يخص نوعا دون نوع. That hey, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't specify a type of goodness to compare it to another type of goodness. I said, be good to them when you speak to them. Be good to them in giving them some wealth or some money or clothing or gifts. No, just mentions just generally in all matters of goodness and kindness. Number 5, the Shaykh mentions تحريم حقوق الوالدين. SubhanAllah, it's beautiful the way the Shaykh breaks it down. He said the great rights of the parents, the obligation of being kind to your parents, and the prohibition of being disobedient to your parents. Look at that, affirmation and negation. Negating disobedience to your parents. And this is something which is a very dangerous matter. Very dangerous matter, because it's mentioned in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. I think we mentioned this last lesson. The hadith on Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who said that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, أَلَا أُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِأَكْبَرَ الْكَبَائِرِ. Shall I not inform you of the worst of the most major of major sins? He mentioned this 3 times. قَالُوا بَلَا يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. They said, of course, Ya Messenger of Allah. He said, al-ishrak billah. He said, associating partners with Allah. وَعَقُوقَ الْوَالِدَيْنِ, and being disobedient to your parents. Then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, وَجَلَسًا كَانَ مُتَّكِئًا. The narrator mentions that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sat up because he was inclined and lying down. He sat up and he said, أَلَا قَوْلَ الزُّورِ. أَلَا قَوْلَ الزُّورِ. And he said, and also, as well, is the false testimony. Lying about something and testifying to it. False testimony. And then he said, the narrator said, فَمَا زَالْ يُكَرِّرْهَا. He continued repeating that. حَتَّى قُلْنَا, until the point that we said, لَيْتَهُ سَكَتْ. We wish he would have remained quiet. We wish he would remain quiet. And this is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. This hadith. So it shows us the importance of not disobeying your parents. Here we would like to read something from Shaykh Uthaymin, rahimahullah, his explanation of Kitāb al-Tawḥīd, al-Qawl al-Mufīd ala Kitāb al-Tawḥīd, volume 1. If you turn to page 33, the Shaykh in his explanation of this ayah, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ, okay, the Shaykh brings a very nice piece talking about the division of al-Ubudiyya, Aqsām al-Ubudiyya, the division of Ubudiyya. Ubudiyya is the servitude of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Servitude of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. this matter is so important, and it's similar to submission, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rules and regulations, submission to Allah. And it also talks about the servitude of worship, meaning purpose of why I was created and who do I worship. This is al-Ubudiyya. So here, Shaykh Uthaymeen brings a very nice section in his explanation of that ayah, that Allah ordered, Allah, your Lord orders you to worship Him alone. This aspect of Ubudiyya is a very important aspect, because when we understand the reasons of our creation, the reasons why we're on this earth, you'll find tranquility and understanding and ease of living your life, and the main aim is not the dunya, not the worldly life, but the hereafter and the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this dunya. Because like Ibn Qayyim mentioned, that the reasons why we feel grief, sadness, depression, anxiety is because of two reasons. One is love of the dunya, the worldly life, and secondly, is deficiency in worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we understand al-Ubudiyya, the servitude of worship, we have tranquility in our lives. There's a beautiful book which I would really advise everybody to read, and it's probably the best thing you're ever going to read. Obviously, after the revelation of the Quran and the Hadith and the statements of the Salaf, after that, the best thing you're probably ever going to read in your life is a book called Al-Ubudiyya. It's called, there is a translation of this, it's called The Essay of Servitude of Worship, or something like this, by Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah. The book itself is called Al-Ubudiyya in Arabic, but the book in English, I think the translation which I'm aware of, Allahu A'lam if there's another translation, Essay in the Servitude of Worship of Allah, something like this, by Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah. I don't know I don't advise with the translator or with the publishers, but the book itself, inshallah, the translation is okay, inshallah. But we advise this because so the people don't become attached to who the translator is and the publishers, but the book in itself, very, very good, and it's sold on the Salafi bookstore of our brothers of Salafi Publications in Birmingham, with the awareness of the translator and the publishers. But the book is probably the best book you're ever going to read. Why? It's based upon the same sort of system as is Kitāb al-Tawḥīd, is ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, compiled and arranged in a certain way. And it's a small book, but it was a reply by Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah to some questions which were put to him. And the questions here were about what is worship, what are the branches of worship, does the whole of the religion enter into this aspect of servitude of worship, what is the reality of this aspect of worship? And Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah gave such a beautiful answer, and it's ayah after ayah after ayah after ayah. And when we read these ayat, automatically our iman increases. And we understand, when we read these ayat and study them, comprehend them, we understand the reality of the servitude of worship al-Ubudiyya. And the Shaykh also, Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah, he answers some of the shubahat, the doubts of the Sufiya and the Qadariyya, and others from the Ahlul Bidah. So it's probably one of the best books you'll ever read, and it will increase your iman, subhanallah, and it will give you principles and a strong foundation in Ubudiyya, in servitude of worship, why Allah created you, why you're here, and all these matters. Probably one of the best books, subhanAllah, that you can ever read. So coming back now to the Aqsam al-Ubudiyya, the divisions, the categories of Ubudiyya, Shaykh, the great scholar, the faqih, the mufassir, Shaykh al-Islam, al-Uthaymin, Muhammad ibn Ṣāliḥ al-Uthaymin, rahimahullah, he said, تنقسم العبودية إلى ثلاثة أقسام. That Ubudiyya, servitude of worship, is divided into three categories. He said the first one is general. It's a general Ubudiyya. Remember, like we studied before, we took before this al-Qada al-Shar'i, Qada Qawmi, that this universal legislation and Sharia legislation. Likewise, this is similar to that, servitude of worship. It's a legislation. The Shaykh says, the first one is general, ammatun. وَهِيَ عُبُودِيَّةَ الرُّبُوبِيَّةِ. It is the servitude of worship in rububiyyah. وَهِيَ لِكُلِّ خَلْقٍ. And it is for all creation. Remember we said, there's universal legislation that the sun shines on everybody. Nobody can get away from it. The rain falls on everybody. Nobody can get away from it. The day and the night is controlled by Allah. The kuffar can't control the day and the night. They don't have any legislation over that. Only Allah has that legislation. So this ubudiyya of rububiyyah is general upon all of the creation. And the Shaykh says, قال الله تعالى, Allah mentions, إِنَّ كُلُّ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Allah says, indeed, every single individual, every living creature, فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, in the heavens and the earth, إِلَّا آتِي الرَّحْمَنِ abda, will come to Ar-Rahman, Allah, as a slave. As a slave. Because the sun shines on each of us. The wind blows on every single one. The rain falls on every single one. So we are subject to that. We are slaves of Allah in that. So Ubudiyya is servitude. Yani being a slave to Allah's Tawḥīd. This is in Surah Maryam, ayah 93. The Shaykh says, وَيَدْخُلُ فِي ذَلِكَ الْكُفَّارِ. That the kuffar even enter into this Ubudiyya, servitude of worship, which is general. The second is Ubudiyya khas, the Ubudiyya which is specific. Ubudiyya which is specific. Ubudiyyatun khasatun. وَهِيَ أُبُودِيَّةُ الطَّاعَةِ وَالْأَمْرِ, which is the servitude of worship in obedience which is general. And legislated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is Ubudiyya of obedience which is general. Servitude of worship to Allah in obedience to Him. In obedience to Allah. As a Muslim, I've submitted myself to Allah. I find out what Allah has said, so I submit, I try my best to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the second one, Ubudiyyatun khas. The first one is general, the second one is specific Ubudiyya. Ubudiyyatun khas. Specific servitude of worship. The Shaykh says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ, the worshippers, the slaves of Ar-Rahman, meaning Allah, الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا, and they walk on the earth in humility and sedatedness. Yani they walk on the earth in a humble form. وَإِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا, and the worshippers of Allah, of Ar-Rahman, walk on the earth in humility and sedatedness, gentle and humility with humbleness. Surah Furqan, ayah 63. The Shaykh says, وَهَذَا تَعَمُّ كُلَّ مَنْ تَعَبَّدَ لِلَّهِ بِشَرْعِهِ. And this is general for everyone who worships Allah with his Sharia. Everyone who submits himself to Allah and worships Allah according to the Sharia, then this includes those people as well. Ubudiyya khas, servitude of worship of Allah, which is specific. Then the Shaykh says that the third type is ubudiyatun khasatun. He says khasatul khas. Khasatul khas, yani the specialized, you can say, the specialized ubudiyya, the specialized servitude of worship. وَهِيَ أُبُودِيَّةُ الرُّسُلِ. And this was the servitude of worship which the messengers had, alayhim as-salatu was-salam. This was the servitude, messengers, the prophets, those that were chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first one is general. The second one is specific ubudiyya. The third one is khasatul khas, the specialized ubudiyya, which is the ubudiyya of which the messengers had, alayhim as-salatu was-salam. Their level of iman was not like the level of iman of anybody else. Not like the level of iman of anybody else. Their submission was not like the level of any other person. The submission, the acceptance of the message that they were told to give, then humility and humbleness for Allah was not like that of anybody else. Their level, their status was much higher. That's why it's specialized. Khasatul khas. The Shaykh says, قال الله تعالى عن نوح, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about Nuh alayhi salam, إنه كان عبدا شكورا, that indeed he was a grateful slave, a grateful servant. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned this type of ayah, similar about Dawood alayhi salam and many other prophets as well. The Shaykh says, وَقَالَ عَنْ مُحَمَّدٍ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِّمَّا نَزَّلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا, Surah Baqarah, ayah 23, and if you are of any doubt, of any shadow of doubt, what we have revealed to our slave, عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا, look how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses our Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says, "Ala abdina," on our slave. He didn't mention our prophet, our messenger. Allah mentioned our slave. So Allah has given him this title of abd, fulfilling that ubudiyya, that servitude of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Nuh kana abdan shukura, a grateful slave. What we have revealed to our slave. That's why they have specialized ubudiyya, specialized level and grade and status. Khas to khas. Shaykh says, وَقَالَ فِي آخَرِينَ مِنَ الرُّسُلِ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about the other messengers. وَاذْكُرْ عِبَادَنَا, وَاذْكُرْ عِبَادَنَا, remember our slaves, our servants, Ibrahim wa Ishaq wa Yaqub, أُولِي الْأَيْدِ وَالْأَبْصَارِ, Surah Sa'd, ayah 45. And remember our slaves, Ibrahim, Prophet, Ishaq wa Yaqub, mentioning these prophets, أُولِي الْأَيْدِ وَالْأَبْصَارِ, those who had strength in their worship, in worshipping Allah, and knowledge, knowledge, wisdom, insight of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Having the knowledge of the deen. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning His prophets. The Shaykh says, فَهَذِهِ الْعُبُودِيَّةِ الْمُضَافِ إِلَى رُسُلِ خَاصَةُ خَاصَ. This is the ubudiyya, the servitude of worship, which is attached to the messengers, specialized, or khas to khas, the best of the best, the specific of this, the most specific. Shaykh says, لِأَنَّهُ لَا يُبَارِي أَحَدٌ هَؤُلَاءِ الرُّسُلِ فِي الْعُبُودِيَّةِ. And that none of these prophets were deficient in their worship, were deficient in their worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in this servitude of being slaves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. with that, we've come to the end of today's lesson and the end of this part of the chapter of the evidence of this chapter. Jazakumullahu khairan for listening. And if there was any mistakes or any deficiency, that was from me and Shaitan. If anything that I was correcting, that was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك وصلى الله على نبينا محمد.